The folder on his desk held 27 years of financial records, 3 acquisition proposals, and 1 personnel file he had never opened until that morning. Jonathan Whitmore set down his coffee and stared at the photograph clipped to the inside cover. His hands were steady. His chest was not. The woman in the photograph was standing in front of a hospital corridor. She was younger in the picture, perhaps 25, 26, but the way she held herself was unmistakable. Straight spine, chin level, eyes that looked at the camera the way a person looks at something they are not afraid of. Jonathan knew that posture. He had seen it every morning for 14 months in the hallway outside his office, and he had never once thought to look closely enough. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and turned to face the window. 41 floors below, the city moved without him. Cars, people, the geometry of ordinary Tuesday mornings. He had built Whitmore Capital from a single rented desk in a building half this size. And in 30 years of business, he had prided himself on one thing above every other. He always knew who he was dealing with. He read people the way other men read financial statements. Quickly, accurately, without sentiment. He had not read Eleanor Davies. Not even close. What he would find in the next 48 hours would not simply correct that error. It would dismantle something inside him that he had spent 30 years constructing, and in its place would leave something quieter and considerably more durable, and something he had not known he was missing until the moment it arrived. But that was still ahead of him. First, there was the matter of what his fiancée had done. Jonathan Whitmore had inherited his father's instinct for loyalty and his mother's instinct for order, which meant that when his director of operations came to him 6 weeks earlier with a formal complaint about a member of the cleaning staff, he had listened carefully, asked 3 questions, and told the man he would handle it personally. He did not delegate personnel matters that came to him directly. That was another thing he prided himself on. His office occupied the corner of the 41st floor, with views on 2 sides. The financial district in one direction, the river in another, and he had arranged it without sentimentality. Clean lines, a single framed photograph of his children on the credenza, a bookshelf that was actually used. People who visited expecting the standard display of trophies and ego objects were always slightly surprised by how functional it looked. Jonathan had stopped finding that surprising about 15 years ago. The director's name was Gregory Kane, and he had been with Whitmore Capital for 11 years. He was efficient, well-dressed, and spoke in the kind of measured sentences that made him sound as though every word had been pre-approved by legal. What he told Jonathan that morning was this: a member of the cleaning staff assigned to the executive floor, a woman named Eleanor Davies, had been removing company property from the building at irregular hours for a period of approximately 3 months. Inventory discrepancies. Security logs. A pattern that aligned precisely with her shift schedule. The evidence, Kane said, was unambiguous. What Jonathan did not know, what he could not have known, because the person who had placed that evidence in Kane's hands had arranged it specifically so he would not know, was that Gregory Kane was not acting alone. The complaint had originated, not with the director's own observations, but with a woman named Serena, who had been Jonathan's fiancée for 8 months, and who had developed, over those 8 months, a particular and specific hostility toward Eleanor Davies that had nothing to do with inventory, and everything to do with the way Jonathan's children spoke about her at dinner. Serena Ashworth was 43 years old, impeccably dressed, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. She had noticed, beginning about 4 months into her relationship with Jonathan, that his 2 children, Thomas, 11, and Emma, 9, talked about the cleaning woman on the executive floor the way children talk about someone who feels like home. Too warmly, too freely, with a comfort that Serena, for all her elegance, had not managed to earn in 8 months of deliberate effort. Eleanor Davies had worked on the 41st floor for 14 months. She arrived before 7 in the morning, left after Jonathan's team had gone for the evening, and in between performed her work with a quietness that he had noticed only in its absence on the 2 mornings she had been sick. The floor felt different on those days. He had attributed it to routine. He had not thought about it further. Thomas had started stopping to talk to her in the corridor sometime around the 3rd month. Emma had followed. By month 6, Jonathan had walked past the two of them sitting on the floor outside the break room, while Eleanor explained something in a low, steady voice, and Thomas had been laughing in the way children laugh when something is genuinely funny, rather than when they are performing for adults. Jonathan had smiled and kept walking. He had a 9 o'clock. What he did not do in all of that time was look at her personnel file. If he had, he would have seen it. He would have seen it immediately, and everything that followed would have been different. But he did not look. And Gregory Kane came to him with evidence, and Serena sat across from him that same evening at dinner, with her hands folded in her lap and her expression arranged in careful concern, and said that she thought he should know, because she cared about his company's integrity, that the rumors about the cleaning woman had been circulating for weeks. Jonathan called a meeting. He did it formally, because that was how he did everything. He asked Eleanor Davies to come to the executive conference room at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. He asked Gregory Kane to be present. He asked his head of security to bring the relevant logs. He did not ask Serena to attend, but she appeared anyway, positioned herself near the door with a glass of water she did not drink, and stayed. Eleanor arrived at 2:58. She was wearing the pale gray uniform of the cleaning staff, and her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried nothing. She took the seat she was offered across from Jonathan and folded her hands on the table in front of her and met his eyes directly. And for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his memory. Something about the quality of her stillness. He pushed it aside. He had a meeting to run. He laid out the evidence methodically. The inventory logs. The security footage, not of her taking anything, but of her near the supply corridor at times that matched the discrepancies. The pattern. The consistency of it. He was fair. He was calm. He asked her directly to explain. Eleanor Davies looked at the table for 3 seconds. Then she looked up. "I understand why it looks the way it looks," she said. Her voice was low and entirely level. "I did not take those items, and I would ask you, Mr. Whitmore, to verify the inventory count yourself before accepting someone else's count as fact." Kane shifted in his seat. Serena, near the door, made a small sound. "The logs are clear," Kane said. "The logs show me near the supply corridor," Eleanor said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Kane when she answered him. She kept her eyes on Jonathan. "They do not show me removing anything." "I would ask you to look at that distinction carefully, sir." Jonathan looked at Kane. Kane looked at his laptop. Something moved through the room that Jonathan could not immediately name. Serena set down her water glass. "Jonathan," she said, "the evidence has been reviewed by 2 department heads. I think we can draw a reasonable conclusion." Eleanor turned to look at Serena then. She looked at her for exactly long enough, and then she looked back at Jonathan, and she said, quietly, addressing only him, as though Serena had not spoken at all, "If you dismiss me without verifying that, count yourself. That will say more about this office than it will ever say about me." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Jonathan said, "You're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out." Eleanor stood. She straightened her uniform jacket. She looked at him once more, and her expression contained no plea and no anger, only a composed and patient certainty that made him feel, in a way he could not explain and would not examine for another 48 hours, as though he were the one who had just failed a test he hadn't known he was sitting. She left the room without looking at Serena. He told himself he had made the right call. The evidence was the evidence. But that evening, after the office had emptied, he sat at his desk and found himself staring at nothing for 20 minutes, which was something he had not done in years. And the next morning, without being entirely sure why, he pulled her personnel file. The photograph stopped him. It stopped him the way a sound stops you, suddenly, before thought, before interpretation. He sat with the file open and the photograph in his hand for a long time. And the longer he sat, the more certain he became of something that was both impossible and completely, devastatingly obvious. He knew that face. He had last seen it 22 years ago, in a hospital corridor, in a city he had traveled to for a conference and had never expected to need a hospital in. He had been 31 years old. A cab had jumped a curb in the rain, and 2 people had been struck, and Jonathan had been one of them. And by every reasonable medical assessment, he should have died from the blood loss before the ambulance arrived. He had not died because someone had found him. Because someone had pressed her coat against the wound in his side with both hands and held it there for 11 minutes in the rain until the paramedics came, and had not let go even when her hands were shaking, and had talked to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, about the weather, about the city, about a garden she was going to plant when she got home, and had kept him conscious and breathing until the moment the paramedics took over. He had tried to find her afterward. He had asked the hospital. He had asked the police report. The responding officer had written, "Unknown female bystander, declined to give name, left scene before transport arrived." She had never asked for anything. She had saved his life and walked away. He had thought about her in the years after, the way you think about something that defines you without being able to name it. He had thought, there are people in the world like that. People who do the necessary thing without calculation and without expectation and without needing anyone to see it. He had tried, in his own way, to be that kind of person. He had not always succeeded. He had sometimes succeeded not at all. And she had been washing the floors outside his office for 14 months. He sat for another long moment. Then he closed the file, stood up, put on his coat, and went to find her. He did not go to her home address with the intention of confrontation. He told himself he only wanted to understand. He told himself the distinction mattered. He drove himself, which he rarely did, because he did not want a driver to see where he was going or to report the destination with the neutral efficiency drivers always deployed when they sensed their employer doing something unusual. He put the address into the navigation system on his phone and followed it south and then east, through the part of the city that the business pages never wrote about and that the architecture firms had never been commissioned to improve. And he noted, without wanting to, how the streets changed as he drove. The transition was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. There was no clear line, no sign marking the boundary. It was gradual, the way most important changes are. A slightly narrower lane here, a slightly shorter building there, a petrol station that had not had its signage updated in 15 years, a grocer with fruit arranged on outdoor tables, covered with a tarpaulin against the possibility of rain. His car was too new for these streets. He felt this the way you feel underdressed, not in an abstract way, but in the specific physical way of a thing that cannot be argued with. The buildings grew shorter, and then shorter still. The pavements narrowed to the width of a single person walking carefully. The trees thinned out entirely, and then stopped, giving way to a kind of gray-green scrub at the edges of the road that was not quite grass and not quite anything else. There was a stretch of 3 blocks where every streetlight was either broken or missing, and his headlights moved over the road like something searching for something it had lost. He passed a row of buildings that had been shops and were not anymore, the ghost outlines of their old signage still faintly legible above the boards. He passed a playground with no children in it, and a fence with 3 missing panels, and a single swing turning slowly in the wind with no one in it. Back and forth, like a clock that had lost track of what it was counting. He passed a woman pushing a pram in the dark, with the particular focused efficiency of someone who has been doing it for a long time and knows exactly how far she still has to go. He drove slowly because the road gave him no other option, and because some part of him, some part that was still trying to argue with what he was doing, still trying to locate an exit from the trajectory the evening had put him on, needed the time. He parked a block from the address and walked. The house was set back from the street behind a short gate that had no latch. The garden was small and tended, which was the first thing that surprised him. Neat rows of something green along the left side of the path, and a painted stone near the door that he could not read in the dark. The house itself was old and in want of repair. The roof had a patch over one section, the window frames were weathered white, and the front step was cracked down the middle. But the door had a new lock. He noticed that. Everything else was held together by time and stubbornness, and the one new thing was the lock. He stood at the gate and understood something about that choice without needing to articulate it. He moved to the side of the house, where a gap in the wooden fence gave a narrow view of the lit back window. He told himself, standing there in the dark, on a street that smelled of damp earth and distant cooking, that he was not the kind of man who looked through gaps in fences. He had, until that moment, believed that to be true. He looked anyway. The kitchen window was lit from inside, and through it he could see the corner of a table and part of a woman's arm moving with something. Folding, he thought, or wrapping. He could not yet see her face. He could hear, from inside, the murmur of a voice, and then another voice, younger, and then a sound that took him a moment to identify. Laughter, small and unguarded. The specific frequency of a child laughing at something that is genuinely funny rather than performed. Then a door opened inside the house, and the sounds changed, and he heard her voice, Eleanor's voice, unmistakably, saying something too low to catch, and then a child's voice said, "Mom, you're home. Did you bring the medicine?" And Eleanor said, "I've got everything, sweetheart. Give me 2 minutes." The little voice said, "Tommy's cough is worse. I've been timing it." And Eleanor said, "I know. I called the clinic from the bus. It's going to be all right." Jonathan Whitmore stood in the dark, outside a broken fence, on a street, with no working street lights, and something in his chest did something that he had no language for, and did not attempt to describe. He pressed one hand flat against the fence board, and breathed through his nose, and told himself to stay still. He heard movement inside. He heard the sound of something being unwrapped, the specific crinkle of medical packaging. He heard Eleanor say something soft and direct in the voice she used when she was managing something difficult without letting the difficulty show. He heard the child, a girl, he thought, 9 or 10, say, "The whole box, Mom? Where did you get a whole box?" And Eleanor said, "It doesn't matter where I got it. It matters that Tommy takes it." And the girl was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice so entirely without artifice that it landed like a stone in still water, "Mom, does Dad know we're okay? Does he know from heaven?" The silence that came after that was 3 seconds long and felt like something geological. Jonathan heard Eleanor's voice break, once, on a single intake of breath, and then compose itself, and she said, "He knows, baby. He always knows." Jonathan stepped back from the fence. He stepped back again. He found the gatepost with one hand and held on to it, and stood in the dark on the street with no lights and looked at nothing. His hands were shaking. He was aware of this the way you are aware of rain. as a fact, not a problem. He could not have said, in that moment, if someone had asked him what year it was, or which direction was north, or how many floors his building had. He sat in his car for a long time before he could start the engine. He did not drive to Serena's apartment. He drove instead to his brother's house, where he sat at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night and put the personnel file on the table and told his brother everything. His brother, Philip, was 5 years older and had the family's instinct for silence in the right moments. He sat across the table and looked at the photograph, and then looked at Jonathan and said, "What are you going to do?" Jonathan said, "I'm going to fix it." "That's not specific enough," Philip said. Jonathan looked at the photograph. He said, "I'm going to find out who told Cain to bring that complaint." He did not have to look far. The answer arrived in pieces over the next 36 hours, and each piece made the picture clearer in the way that is worse, not better, than not knowing. A review of the security system, conducted not by Cain but by the head of it, whom Jonathan trusted and Cain did not know well, revealed that the corridor footage near the supply room had been reviewed and selectively logged. Someone with access to the internal reporting system had flagged discrepancies that aligned, not with Eleanor's schedule, but with Cain's own supply orders. What Eleanor had been doing near the corridor, every single time, was noting a consistently broken lock on the supply room door and submitting a maintenance request. She had submitted the same request 11 times over 3 months. It had been dismissed 11 times by the same person. Gregory Cain had been systematically removing supplies from inventory and adjusting the logs to point the discrepancy at whoever was most conveniently present and least able to defend themselves. Eleanor Davies, with no long-term employment history at the company and no advocate in the building, had been the most convenient target available. And Serena had noticed Cain's anxiety about a recent audit and had offered him a solution: focus the attention elsewhere. She had no financial stake in it. She had simply wanted the woman gone. Jonathan called Serena on a Tuesday evening. He asked her to meet him at the office the next morning. When she arrived, the conference room held not just the two of them, but his HR director, his company lawyer, Philip, the head of it, and Gregory Cain, who had received a different kind of invitation and understood, from the moment he entered the room, that the structure of the meeting was not in his favor. Jonathan said very little. He let the IT director present the findings. He watched Cain's expression move through denial and adjustment, and then arrive, eventually, at a species of silence. He watched Serena's composure operate at maximum effort for about 4 minutes before it began to show its seams. When the IT director finished, Jonathan said, "Gregory, clean out your office. Security will be outside the door in 15 minutes. He looked at Serena. He said, in a voice from which he had deliberately removed everything unnecessary, "And I would ask you to return my key, the building key and the one for the car. I'll have my brother collect the rest." Serena said his name. She said it as though saying it were enough. He looked at her for a moment. He said she had nothing to lose. She still stood straight. "That's the difference between you." He left the room. 2 hours later, his executive assistant called Eleanor Davies and asked if she would be willing to come in. Eleanor said she would. She arrived the way she always arrived, precisely on time, without performance, with her hands still and her spine straight, and her eyes on whoever she was speaking to. Jonathan met her in the corridor outside his office, rather than the conference room, because the conference room had been the last place she had been made to feel small, and he was not going to add to that list. He said, "I owe you an apology. I looked at the evidence I was given instead of verifying it myself. You told me to verify it. I should have listened." Eleanor said, "I know what I was accused of, Mr. Whitmore. I know you do. But I want to say something else." He paused. He had rehearsed this and still found it difficult, which told him something. 22 years ago, in Manchester, outside the Radisson on a Thursday night in November, I was hit by a cab that jumped the pavement. Do you remember? The corridor was very quiet. The air conditioning made its low sound. Eleanor Davies looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not surprise, but was close to it. Something more like recognition arriving at a destination it had been approaching for 14 months. She said, "You were conscious when they took you. That was what mattered. You held your coat against my side for 11 minutes in the rain. It was what needed to be done. You never told me your name." "No." Jonathan looked at her. He said, "I spent a long time trying to find the kind of person you were that night. I thought it was a rare thing. It turns out it was not rare at all. It was standing in my corridor every morning." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked down, once, and then back up. "My husband used to say that a person shows you who they are by what they do when no one is watching." Jonathan said, "Your husband?" She said, "He died 4 years ago. He worked on a construction site. It was a safety issue that should have been addressed years earlier. He left me with Thomas and Emma." A pause. "They're 9 and 11 now." The weight of the world reorganized itself slightly around Jonathan Whitmore's shoulders. He said, "I want to make you a specific offer, not out of guilt, or not only, because you have demonstrated, in 14 months in this building, a quality of judgment and character that most people in senior positions here have not demonstrated in years." He looked at her steadily. "I am creating an employee welfare and workplace safety division within this company. The position of director is currently empty. I would like you to fill it. Full contract. Full salary. Full authority over the program's design." Eleanor said, "I clean floors. You've been doing that for 14 months to pay for medicine and feed 2 children. You have a degree in organizational management. It was on your application. I didn't read your application." She was quiet. "I also intend," Jonathan said, "to establish a fund. It will be named the Robert Davies Workplace Safety Scholarship, after your husband. It will cover university tuition for the children of workers injured or killed due to workplace negligence. Thomas and Emma will be its first beneficiaries." He paused. "I want it to mean something, not just to manage guilt, to mean something." The corridor held them in its quiet. Eleanor said, "He would have found that exactly right." That evening, Jonathan's house held more people than it had in years. Philip came. The IT director came. The old family lawyer, who had been with the Whitmore family for 3 decades, came and stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea and said nothing, which was his specific way of saying everything. Thomas and Emma came because they had been staying with Jonathan's sister while everything settled, and they arrived loudly and went immediately to Eleanor, who received them the way the sea receives things, without drama, without asking them to be smaller. Thomas said, "I knew it. I knew it wasn't true." Emma said nothing. She held on to Eleanor's arm and looked at Jonathan with the particular judicial clarity of a 9-year-old who has already decided what she thinks of a person and is simply confirming whether the evidence supports her. And then, apparently satisfied with what she found there, let go and went to look in the refrigerator. Margaret, the building's head housekeeper, who had worked on the 41st floor for longer than anyone, had been Jonathan's quiet witness through every morning of the preceding 14 months. She had been the one who saw Eleanor submit each maintenance request. She had been the one who had watched Kane dismiss them. She had said nothing, because she did not have authority and was not built for confrontation, and that was the one thing she had not done right, and she knew it. She arrived that evening unannounced, stood in the hallway with her coat still on, and said to Eleanor, I should have spoken sooner." Eleanor said, "You're here now." And Margaret sat down at the table and did not say anything else. But the relief on her face was visible to everyone in the room and required no further articulation. They ate together around a table that was too small for the number of people who had arranged themselves around it, and someone found an extra chair in the hall. And Philip poured wine and sparkling water in equal measure, and the old lawyer made a joke that was 20 years out of date, and everyone laughed anyway. And Jonathan sat at the head of the table and watched the specific mathematics of people becoming, however tentatively, something new. Thomas ate 3 helpings and talked about a science project with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for a sympathetic audience. Emma fell asleep against Eleanor's arm between the main course and dessert, and was transferred to the sofa with the particular efficiency of adults who have done this before, and the conversation continued around her absence and was somehow warmer for it. At some point late in the evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep on the sofa under his own jacket, and Emma had been persuaded upstairs, and the other guests had found their coats, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window while Jonathan stacked the last of the plates. The window was dark, reflecting the kitchen back at them. The garden beyond it was invisible. A candle on the windowsill had been burning since dinner. Jonathan had not lit it. He was not entirely sure who had, but it had been burning steadily for 2 hours. In the stillness of the kitchen, in the particular quiet that follows large meals and long days and things resolved, the candle flame bent slowly to the left. Once, completely without reason. The window was closed. There was no draught. The flame moved as though something had passed through the room that they were not the right instruments to detect, and then it steadied again and continued to burn. Eleanor saw it. She said nothing, but the quality of her silence changed in a way that Jonathan noticed without understanding, and he did not ask her about it, because some things do not require asking about. He looked at the flame for a moment. He thought of a hospital corridor 22 years ago. He thought of a woman who had held her coat against a stranger's wound for 11 minutes in the rain and then walked away without leaving her name. He thought of what it cost to be that kind of person, quietly, without recognition, across a whole life. He thought of Thomas coughing in a house with one new lock and no working streetlights outside. He thought of Robert Davies, who had died on a site that should have been safer, and whose name would be on a scholarship before the month was out. He thought, the things we do when no one is watching do not disappear. They accumulate. They become, in time, the only things that last. Eleanor turned from the window. She said, "I should get home." The clinic said to call before 8 tomorrow. Jonathan said, "I'll arrange a car." She looked at him with the same expression she had worn across the conference room table weeks ago, when she had told him that what he failed to verify would say more about his house than about her. Only now the expression held something additional, something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, like the early and cautious architecture of trust. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Jonathan." She considered that for a moment. She said, "Good night, then," and she went to collect her coat. He stood in the kitchen a moment longer. The candle was still burning. Outside, the garden was beginning to be visible again as his eyes adjusted. The dark shape of the fence, the outline of the flower beds, the particular blue-gray quality of a late-night sky over a city that never entirely sleeps. If you have ever carried something necessary for someone who did not know you were carrying it, if you have ever been the person in the corridor who does the work and asks for nothing and is not seen, then you know that the question is never whether anyone noticed. The question is whether the thing you did was worth doing regardless. Eleanor Davies already knew the answer to that question. She had known it for a long time, and on a Tuesday evening, in a kitchen that smelled of dinner and old wood and the last of somebody's tea, Jonathan Whitmore, who had 30 years of business and a 41-floor building, and a reputation for never being wrong about a person. Finally, quietly, and about 14 months later than he should have, began to know it too. Every life, if you look at it carefully enough, contains one moment that divides it cleanly into before and after. Most people never find out where their moment was, because the moment does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with sirens and significance. Sometimes it arrives as a woman in a pale gray uniform, standing in a corridor with her hands still, and her spine straight, and her eyes on you, waiting, with a patience she has practiced across a whole life of being underestimated, for you to finally look closely enough to see what has been standing in front of you all along.